She left the house to us, my cousin Melissa said, sliding the paper across the table like it was nothing. The lawyer said Grandma felt we brought her more joy. I guess 10 years of you doing the actual work just wasn't the same thing. I sat there in the attorney's office, my hands still smelling faintly of the lavender lotion I used every night to rub into my grandmother's swollen ankles for a decade. And I looked at Melissa's manicured hands holding a document that had just erased 10 years of my life like it was a footnote. I didn't cry in that room. I saved that for later. But I also didn't leave without saying exactly what needed to be said. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, hit the like button now. If you've ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you, comment here below. And subscribe to Story Retribution, because today's ending proves that karma always arrives, just not when people expect it. My grandmother, Eleanor, raised me for large stretches of my childhood while my parents worked demanding jobs. And when she began struggling with early-stage Parkinson's 10 years ago, at 78 years old, I didn't think twice about becoming her primary caregiver. I was 28 then, single, working a stable but flexible marketing job I eventually scaled back to part-time, moving into the small in-law suite attached to her house so I could be present for the daily realities of her care, the medication schedules, the physical therapy exercises, the falls in the middle of the night, the slow, grinding loneliness that chronic illness brings to a person's life. My cousins, Melissa and her brother Trent, lived 4 hours away, visiting maybe twice a year, usually around Christmas and Grandma's birthday, always arriving with expensive gifts, cheerful energy, and a talent for making every visit feel like a celebration rather than the exhausting daily reality I lived inside year-round. The small betrayal happened early on, about a year into my caregiving, when Melissa visited for a weekend and remarked cheerfully over dinner, "Grandma seems so much happier when we're here. I think she just needs more positive energy around her." I remember feeling something twist in my chest, exhausted after months of sleepless nights managing medication side effects and doctor's appointments. Listening to my cousin suggest that 2 days of festive visits outweighed the daily labor keeping our grandmother alive and comfortable, I let it go, telling myself Melissa simply didn't understand the reality of full-time caregiving, that her comment came from ignorance rather than cruelty. The bigger betrayal deepened slowly over the following years, a pattern I didn't fully recognize until it was too late to change course. Every family gathering, every phone call with extended relatives, seemed to center Melissa and Trent's occasional visits as the highlight of Grandma's year, while my daily presence became invisible, expected, unremarkable. The background labor nobody thought to acknowledge because it simply always continued, day after day, without pause or applause. My own social life shrank considerably over those 10 years. I missed weddings, missed vacations, turned down job opportunities that would have required relocating, all because Grandma needed consistent, reliable care that couldn't simply pause for my own life to happen alongside it. I told myself repeatedly that this sacrifice mattered, that being present for someone who had once been so present for me was worth every missed opportunity. Grandma, for her part, expressed gratitude often in quiet, private moments, thanking me during late-night conversations when sleep wouldn't come, telling me stories about her own childhood while I helped her with physical therapy exercises, occasionally saying things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you here," during particularly difficult stretches of her declining health. But in front of Melissa and Trent during their infrequent visits, Grandma's demeanor shifted, brighter, more animated, energized by the novelty of their presence in a way that 10 years of consistent, exhausting care from me simply couldn't replicate. I understood intellectually that this was simply human nature, that consistency naturally becomes less remarkable than novelty. But understanding it didn't make it hurt any less, watching my grandmother light up for 2 days a year, in a way she rarely did during the other 363. About 8 months before Grandma passed, her condition worsened significantly, requiring around-the-clock care that pushed me to my absolute limit. I hired part-time help to cover overnight shifts, funded entirely from my own savings since Grandma's fixed income barely covered her medical expenses. I remember calling Melissa during this period, exhausted, asking if she or Trent might be able to help cover some of the additional caregiving costs given how difficult things had become. Melissa's response still sits heavy in my memory. "We're happy to visit more," she said, But honestly, the day-to-day stuff has always kind of been your thing. You're just better suited for it than we are." I didn't push further. I simply absorbed the comment, the way I'd absorbed a decade of similar moments, and continued doing what needed to be done. Grandma passed away peacefully 8 months later, with me by her side, holding her hand through her final hours, having spent the previous decade of my life ensuring she never faced her declining years alone or without dignity. The will reading happened 3 weeks after the funeral. At the attorney's office, Melissa and Trent arriving together, dressed formally, sitting across the table from me with an ease that suggested they anticipated good news. The attorney, a careful, professional man named Mr. Fairweather, read through the will's provisions methodically. Most of Grandma's modest savings and personal belongings were divided relatively evenly among the three of us grandchildren, appropriate and expected. But when Mr. Fairweather reached the section addressing the house I had lived in and cared for her within for 10 years, the house I had genuinely believed, based on years of Grandma's private comments, would eventually be mine. His expression grew slightly uncomfortable. "The house has been left jointly to Melissa and Trent," he said, reading directly from the document. I sat there momentarily unable to process what I'd just heard. Melissa slid a printed copy of the relevant section across the table toward me, her expression carefully neutral. "The lawyer said Grandma felt we brought her more joy," she said. "I guess 10 years of you doing the actual work just wasn't the same thing." I looked at Mr. Fairweather, my voice barely steady. "Is there an explanation attached to this? Anything about why she decided this specifically?" Mr. Fairweather hesitated, glancing at a separate document in his folder. "There is a personal letter your grandmother asked me to include with the will's reading," he said carefully. "Would you like me to read it now?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice with more than that. Mr. Fairweather opened the letter and began reading Grandma's own words, her familiar handwriting visible on the page even from where I sat. "To my grandchildren," the letter began. "I know this will won't feel fair to everyone, and I've thought long and hard about how to explain my decisions. Melissa and Trent, you brought me joy every time you visited, and I loved seeing you both. But joy isn't the same as love, and it certainly isn't the same as sacrifice. I want to be honest about something I should have said more clearly while I was alive." Mr. Fairweather paused, glancing at me briefly before continuing. "My granddaughter gave me 10 years of her life, not 2 days a year, not holiday visits with expensive gifts, but 10 years of sleepless nights, missed opportunities, and a level of daily devotion I don't think either of you have ever fully understood or acknowledged." Melissa's confident expression began to falter. "I left the house to Melissa and Trent," the letter continued, "not because I valued their visits more, but because I knew my granddaughter, having lived in that house for a decade, needed something different from me. Not a physical building tied to years of exhausting labor, but something that would actually let her finally build a life beyond these walls." Mr. Fairweather reached into the folder and pulled out a second document. "Attached to this letter," he said, "is a separate provision. Your grandmother established a trust fund 18 months before her passing, funded through a life insurance policy she'd maintained privately for years. This trust is designated entirely for you." "Wait, what?" Melissa said, staring at the second document now being placed in front of me. "The trust," Mr. Fairweather explained, "was substantial, enough to fully cover a down payment on a home of my own, enough to fund the return to full-time work I'd stepped away from for a decade, enough to represent in concrete financial terms exactly the acknowledgement Grandma had apparently understood I needed, but hadn't managed to say clearly enough while she was still alive. She wanted you to have something that was entirely, uncomplicatedly yours," Mr. Fairweather continued, still reading from Grandma's letter. "Not tied to a house full of memories of caregiving and exhaustion, but something new, something that represents the years you're allowed to finally reclaim for yourself." The letter continued, addressing Melissa and Trent directly one final time. "I hope you'll use the house responsibly, and I hope someday you'll understand what your cousin gave up so I could live my final years with dignity, in my own home, surrounded by someone who never once made me feel like a burden, even during the hardest months." Melissa sat frozen, the confident, slightly smug posture from earlier completely gone. Trent stared down at the table, uncomfortable silence stretching across the room. I didn't know about the trust, Melissa finally said quietly. I didn't know she felt this way about how things were divided. She never said anything like this to us, Trent added, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I sat there, tears finally falling, not from anger anymore, but from something more complicated. Relief that Grandma had, in her own quiet way, seen and understood exactly what those 10 years had cost me, even when she hadn't always found the words to say it clearly while she was alive. The family reactions unfolded slowly over the following weeks. Melissa reached out privately, apologizing for the comment she'd made in the attorney's office, admitting she'd never fully considered what a decade of daily caregiving actually meant compared to her infrequent, celebratory visits. I think I convinced myself the visits mattered just as much, she said during a difficult but honest phone call, because it was easier than admitting I hadn't sacrificed anything close to what you did. I didn't feel triumphant, sorting through Grandma's letter again privately in the weeks that followed. I felt something steadier and more complicated than triumph. The quiet, aching relief of finally being seen, fully and clearly, by the one person whose acknowledgement had mattered most, even if that acknowledgement arrived only after she was already gone. The emotional resolution settled over me slowly, moving into a small apartment of my own for the first time in a decade, using the trust to finally return to full-time work, rebuilding a life I'd set aside so completely that relearning its shape felt strange and unfamiliar at first. The final lesson settled over me months later, unpacking boxes in my new apartment, finding Grandma's old lavender lotion tucked among my things, a small physical reminder of 10 years I'd never regret, despite everything that had happened at that attorney's office. Melissa and Trent had spent a decade assuming that joy and consistency were interchangeable, that 2 festive days a year could somehow equal the invisible, unglamorous labor of showing up every single day for someone whose decline required patience, exhaustion, and a level of devotion that never once made headlines or generated applause. They mistook my quiet consistency for something unremarkable, never imagining that the grandmother watching all of it unfold year after year understood exactly what she was witnessing, even when she struggled to say it clearly while she still had the chance. I never raised my voice in that attorney's office. I didn't need to. Grandma's own words, saved carefully for exactly this moment, said everything 10 years of quiet, exhausting devotion never managed to say clearly enough on its own. Karma doesn't always arrive as punishment for someone else. Sometimes it simply arrives as being finally, fully seen, even if that recognition comes one letter, one conversation, one moment too late to have changed anything, except how the story finally gets remembered. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my situation? If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, emotional drama, shocking revenge, and the justice that always finds its way back, subscribe to Story Retribution and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story. Tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable. See you then.